He's one of the most hated men in history.
He suffered very much from paranoid personality disorder.
Certainly, he had a reputation for being bloodthirsty and ruthless.
Most people know him from a brutal Bible story, the Massacre of the Innocents. But his bloody reputation hides another side of King Herod the Great. He was an architectural mastermind.
He is the single most important person in the archaeology of the land of Israel. He left an architectural imprint that is still visible today.
From his imagination sprang fortresses, temples, and cities so audacious they astound architects and engineers today. But Herod left a riddle that has remained unsolved. Where did he build his own tomb? A decade ago, archaeologists thought they'd found it. It was called the greatest archaeological discovery since the Dead Sea Scrolls.
This is where I lift my hands and say, wow, we have it.
But now, new research may be turning this discovery on its head.
It is impossible, inconceivable. This could not be the resting place of Herod the Great.
It's time to reopen the case of Herod's tomb. A reputation for bloody murder has always overshadowed another legacy of the king of Judea in the time of Christ. Herod changed the landscape of the Holy Land by building many of its masterpieces of architecture. Masada, an ancient fortress high atop a soaring mountain stronghold. Herod had the vision to transform it into a luxurious palace complex that seemed to defy gravity. Jerusalem's Second Temple. It was part of one of the largest sacred complexes of its time. To keep it pure, it is said Herod trained 1,000 Jewish priests in construction techniques. It was Herod who built its Western Wall, Judaism's most sacred site, and a place of reverence for Muslims and Christians.
He built more monuments, larger monuments, more elaborate monuments than any other person in history.
Herod is absolutely a hands-on person when it comes to the design of these buildings. Herod is not likely to be sitting at a drafting board, but Herod is the mastermind. These projects all have marks of grandeur, imagination, and expansiveness. There is a largeness to them that is quite remarkable.
Finally, there is Herod's memorial to himself, called Herodium. A 50-acre complex Herod engineered for his burial, just 8 miles south of Jerusalem. Herodium consists of a palace fortress in the mountain's crater, and in the valley below, one of the largest palace complexes created anywhere. But here lies a maddening riddle. Somewhere in the sprawling ruin, ancient sources tell us is Herod's tomb. Finding it became the obsession of one man, Hebrew University archaeologist Ehud Netzer.
I came to archaeology from an architectural background.
And the fact that became clear to me through the years is that in building, Herod was logical. He had his feet
on the ground.
Netzer's fascination with Herod's triumphs of architecture drew him to Herodium and compelled him to take on the quest for Herod's tomb.
Whenever I come back to Herodium, there is something overwhelming in the site. The grandeur of the site, and in particular the hill.
It was on that hill that Netzer's team made a discovery that would rock the archaeological world. On the side of Herodium's mountain, the searchers uncovered the ruins of a monumental structure. They found the richly decorated remains of what looked like a mausoleum. And even more exciting, pieces of an ornate red sarcophagus, or coffin.
It was terrific to uncover it, to get the feeling that we really have it.
But did they really have it? Was it too soon to claim this was the tomb of King Herod the Great? Netzer's team hadn't yet found a name inscribed anywhere. And mysteriously, the sarcophagus they believed was Herod's seemed to have been deliberately smashed into hundreds of pieces. Learning who destroyed it and why could provide clues to help verify Herod's resting place. Team member Raquel Chachi tried to make sense of the pieces.
It's for sure a puzzle. There are so many elements, and every day can bring some other detail, that it's as if every day you have to reconstruct your own idea about the monument.
To solve this monumental mystery, Netzer's team got help from the first-century historian, Flavius Josephus. Thanks to this Jerusalemite, more is known about the life of Herod than any other major character in the New Testament, including Jesus. Netzer's team was led almost to the door of Herod's tomb itself by one event teasingly described by Josephus. The Judean desert, around 4 BC. One of the world's most powerful men, Rome's appointed king of the Jews, is dead. Though Jewish by faith, Herod was an Arab by blood. Critics called him a half-Jew and said he stole the throne like a fox, ruled like a tiger, but died like a dog. He died despised and probably insane, but not before planning a lavish farewell to a nation glad to see him go. Josephus wrote,
"The bier was of gold, studded with precious stones. On this lay the body, wrapped in a purple robe. A crown encircling the head, the scepter beside his hand. Around the bier were a group of his relations. These were followed by the guards, Germans and Gauls, all equipped for war. The body was thus conveyed in accordance with the directions of the deceased. So ended Herod's reign."
And so ended Josephus's description. The funeral goes to Herodium, but the historian doesn't reveal the tomb's location. Nearly 2,000 years later, Ehud Netzer was determined to fill in the blanks. He figured if he could locate the place where the mourners gathered, he'd likely find the tomb nearby. A building at Herodium's far edge piqued his curiosity. It's called a triclinium, a room for eating, talking, and mourning. Triclinia often appear in funerary sites.
These places were used for meals after the burial or when people came to visit.
Netzer sensed he was near the tomb.
We excavated it about 30 years ago with a lot of enthusiasm.
Details in every structure the team exposed told them they were looking at a burial compound on a Herodian scale. And yet, after countless digs, they found no sign of the mausoleum.
When we finished the triclinium and nothing came, it was a frustration. We explored a room next to the triclinium, and it was empty. So this was another stage of concentrated frustration.
But that didn't stop Netzer. His pursuit went on for decades. Finally, in 2006, he had a fateful insight into the mind of the Builder King. That insight led his team up Herod's Mountain and into archaeological history. Herod worked closely with architects and engineers to make sure they properly executed his grand designs. One of his most innovative projects was Herod's Mountain, a monument to his engineering genius. This is a mountain that was actually man-made. Stone quarried from one hill went into building a palace on the adjoining hill, and earth filled in a cone around the top. This flattened the neighboring hill, while making Herodium's man-made mountain soar 330 feet above the desert. Under Herod's direction, workers built the mountain and palace complex in just a few years. Archaeologist Yakov Kolman has excavated at Herodium for decades.
Physically, I can really relate it to them and understand how hard the work is. Working in the heat of the day and carrying baskets of dirt and stones, it's difficult work. I can feel the hardness of the work there.
Manufacturing the mountain might have been the easy part. The biggest challenge must have been the opulent castle perched atop the mountain. This pleasure palace was made of gleaming white stone that could be seen all the way from Jerusalem, 8 miles away. Here Herod could entertain his friends in the high style of his patrons in Rome. Once, this was a luxurious temperate sauna.
The room is part of the bathhouse. What's special about it is the way it's been built. It has a dome on it, which is the first time we actually see a dome in Israel.
This, the oldest dome yet found in Israel, was probably built using a wooden frame. On it, workers laid stones carefully cut to evenly distribute their weight. Then, they took the frame away. While it boasted the luxuries of a pleasure palace, the mountain's double walls and enemy-spotting towers are hallmarks of a fortress. But why build his hybrid complex far from civilization in the harsh Judean desert? For a very personal reason. Herodium was the site of the one battle that changed the life of the man who would be king.
To understand why Herod chose Herodium as the site of his everlasting memorial to himself, his tomb, you have to understand what happened at the beginning of his reign.
It was 40 BC. Judea was under Roman rule. Herod wasn't yet king. He was a Rome-supported governor, known for a hot temper and quick sword. That year, Parthians, from modern-day Iran, invaded Judea and took Jerusalem from the Romans. With his family and army, Herod made a risky nighttime escape. It wasn't like him to run from a fight, but he was outnumbered. His plan was to return with Roman legions. Suddenly, the wagon carrying Herod's mother overturned. Herod believed she had perished and considered joining her in death. But their pursuers were upon them. Instead of killing himself, Herod led the defining battle of his life. Against all odds, he defeated his enemies. And on this site, he vowed to build his palace, Herodium.
And he perhaps made a vow to be buried here. So this is how it started.
His mother survived, but Herod's victory was short-lived. His enemies regrouped and pursued him, so he retreated further south to a place called Masada, a fortress he would later transform into an astonishing feat of engineering of a totally different kind. Masada comes from the Hebrew word for fortress, but to the Jewish people, it means more. Over a century after Herod found sanctuary here, Jewish rebels made a heroic but futile last stand against Judea's Roman occupiers. In 40 BC, Herod came to Masada from a victorious battle. But to win the war, he'd need legions from his masters in Rome.
So we pick up the story in a very critical moment in his career. He fled Jerusalem, he won at Herodium. What to do next? Where do you go from there? I think the best solution was Masada.
He left his mother and other family members at this sky fort, then went to get reinforcements. But while he was gone, Masada's cisterns ran dry.
They were trapped here. They ran out of water. They were surrounded by the Parthians. He could have lost everything.
Just when surrendering would mean certain death, rain came to the rescue.
All the water cisterns were filled, and they could survive until he came back as a king and rescued them. And I think the road to glory, the yellow brick road, was paved for him ever since.
Herod wouldn't forget his family's suffering at Masada. Instead, he'd transform it into an engineering marvel.
Stone speaks at Masada. If I look at Masada, and I want to give you an example how archaeology, how stones reflect the psychic state of mind of the king, we can look at the overdoing of the oversize of the water cisterns. He constructed a huge system of water cisterns containing an amount of millions of gallons of water, 40,000 cubic meters, enable him to sustain an army of 10,000 soldiers for a period of several years of siege.
Herod's 20 cisterns held about 10.5 million gallons of water, as much as 16 Olympic-sized swimming pools. To keep them full, he had to capture the desert's infrequent rains.
We're actually walking in the original remains of the upper aqueduct of King Herod the Great here at Masada. You can see the actual channel, the plaster that held the water.
Workers carved channels into the plateau. These guided precious rainwater along the mountains and into the cisterns. His water supply secure, Herod turned to life's finer things and engineering novelties that are still surprising today. This room stored large containers of wine imported from Italy. If an urn broke, the wine would spill into vessels below the holes.
You can replace your servant, but not your precious wine. That's priorities of the king. We're standing, I think, in one of the greatest achievements of King Herod the Great, in the terraced palace, the hanging palace in the northern part of Masada. One of the greatest examples for the architectural vision and accomplishment of the king.
Herod's crowning achievement at Masada is the three-tiered palace on its northern face.
He takes advantage of an already existing natural mountain, which is quite dramatic in and of itself. And on top of it, he situates a palace that literally hangs over the edge of the cliff. So it's a brilliant marriage of architecture and landscape.
For me, Masada is a reflection of the entire reign of King Herod the Great. Masada was built throughout his reign.
And throughout his tempestuous reign, Herod returned again and again to improve and enjoy his sanctuary in the sky.
You have the breeze at night coming even in the hottest days. You can just imagine the king sitting here with one of his beloved, drinking red wine coming from south of Italy, enjoying life. It's good to be a king.
It's good if you live to enjoy it. To make sure he did, Herod built not one rock wall, but two around Masada's perimeter.
One wonders why to build such a wall on a sheer cliff like that, presumably reflecting the state of mind of the king.
Herod was preparing for a siege.
We don't have to guess about why Herod built Masada, because in fact Josephus tells us that Herod fortified Masada because of fears of an internal Jewish revolt against him.
Josephus wrote,
Herod prepared this fortress for fear of the multitude of the Jews, lest they should depose him and restore their former kings to the government.
Herod had been appointed king of Judea by the Romans, by an outside power. So in the eyes of the Jews, he wasn't a legitimate ruler. And he wasn't descended from the native Jewish line of kings, the Hasmonean line.
In 40 BC, Herod had fled Jerusalem a governor, but returned a king. The Roman rulers, Mark Antony and Augustus, had named Herod King of the Jews. In 3 years, Herod drove the Parthians out of Judea and crushed their supporters, his future Jewish subjects. They never forgave him for ravaging the country, nor for the family murders that marred his reign, and probably inspired one of the best known and most terrifying episodes in the New Testament, the massacre of the innocents. The Gospel of Matthew's famed account tells of the 3 wise men searching for the baby Jesus. Their quest alerted Herod the Great to the birth of the newborn king of the Jews. Fearing a usurper, Herod ordered all Bethlehem's male children under 2 years murdered. The Gospel was written nearly a century after the birth of Christ, and many scholars questioned the veracity of the account. But that doesn't mean the massacre wasn't in character.
Matthew's depiction of Herod as being somebody who would slaughter innocent children does have a factual basis in the sense that Herod is known to have killed or had murdered his own family members.
To strengthen his ties to the throne, Herod married a princess from Judea's ruling dynasty, the Hasmoneans.
Herod apparently tried to marry his way into the Hasmonean line by marrying a Hasmonean woman named Mariamne, who, as it turns out, had a tragic end.
Herod was determined no other man would have her. Whenever a dangerous mission called him away, he left secret orders for her to be killed should he not return. But then, the confidant Herod entrusted with the command told her of the king's plans. Herod had him killed. And later, his beloved wife. Now, the major threats to Herod's throne were his own Hasmonean sons.
Members of the household were spreading rumors about them, that they were not loyal to Herod, that they were plotting to take over, that they were plotting to do away with him. So Herod also had them put to death.
It's not a natural way to think about father killing his own sons. It's abnormal. He killed them all. Killed them all.
Herod's gift for inspiring hostility was unmatched. And in 20 BC, he was about to give some of his people another monumental reason to detest him. It started with a battle that changed the course of history, Actium. And Herod bet it all on the loser. For years, Mark Antony had been Herod's chief Roman supporter. That abruptly ended when he and his co-ruler, Caesar Augustus, fought a famous naval battle off the coast of Greece.
The Battle of Actium then is a real turning point for Herod, because until the Battle of Actium, Herod's fortunes had been tied to Mark Antony.
Mark Antony lost, and Herod's future seemed to sink with him. But if Herod had anything going for him, it was ego and nerve.
Herod decides to chase directly off to Augustus. He goes to meet him. It's an act of great, not only courage, but of chutzpah, imaginatively confronting Augustus. And he says to him, in effect, I was loyal all these years to Mark Antony. Now I will turn and I will be loyal to you.
And then to show his loyalty to Augustus, Herod built a couple of monumental cities in his kingdom and named them in honor of Augustus. And one of those is the city of Caesarea Maritima, Caesarea on the sea.
It was a classic act of Herodian hubris, a monumental feat of architecture that would secure his future and further alienate his people.
Caesarea Maritima is a whole city and an enormous harbor. The object was to bring trade through Judea. And in this, he had a major economic impact on the region.
The city that filled Judea's coffers pleased the Romans and disturbed many Jews. That's because Caesarea was a pagan playground, filled with all the amenities a Roman abroad might enjoy. A hippodrome for athletics and chariot races. A Roman-style theater for the performing arts. And a distinctly non-Jewish pagan temple to Rome and the city's namesake, Caesar Augustus. The Romans were delighted, but the Jews were not. So Herod set out to change his negative image, starting with his most ambitious project to date, expanding the Great Temple in Jerusalem. This is Judaism's most sacred site, the western wall of the Second Temple complex, destroyed by Rome about 70 years after Herod's death. Some come to the western wall to mourn the temple's destruction. Others to celebrate life with weddings and bar mitzvahs. The wall is almost all that remains of Herod's attempt to convince his subjects of his own religious fervor.
Herod was clearly trying to win the favor of the Jews.
Herod wanted to build a temple to his God, to show that the God of Israel, the God of Judaism, outranked, in his view, all those Roman gods.
As Herod envisioned it, the Second Temple would be one of the largest sacred complexes of its time, dwarfing the mightiest pagan shrines of Rome. Its courts, galleries, and the temple itself occupied a platform measuring about 1.5 million square feet, equal to about 27 football fields. With the temple today all but gone, the ingenuity of Herod's plans lies in underground tunnels. This is the largest building stone ever discovered in Israel. It's 42 feet long, 11 feet high, and 14 feet deep. It weighs a staggering 660 tons. Scientists have determined this stone came from a quarry just miles from the Second Temple site. Cut blocks left behind suggest a massive stone harvesting operation that yielded the temple monoliths. First, with hammers, chisels, and wedges, workers separated blocks from limestone bedrock. The next step, masterfully engineered Roman cranes hoisted the blocks onto wagons or rollers. From here, they went straight to the temple. Of Herod's last and most sacred monument, Jewish priest conceded, "He who has never seen the temple of Herod has never seen a beautiful building." Yet Herod himself would never witness its ultimate beauty. He died about 16 years after the first temple stone was set in place, long before it was completed. And he chose Herodium as his burial place. But his tomb seemed to vanish, leaving one of the great archaeological riddles of all time. In 2006, Ehud Netzer and his team were once again searching for Herod's lost tomb. They followed an architectural treasure map that pointed to the Eastern Tower as a likely spot. From ceramic evidence, the team knew people had lived in Upper Herodium's palace after Herod's burial. But burials contaminate living quarters, according to Jewish law. So Netzer concluded the tomb couldn't be in the Eastern Tower, but it might be below. Looking for an entrance in the hillside, the searchers uncovered a large wall and probed beneath it.
This wall is very important. This wall is actually the one that brought us here. And down below here, we can see the structure of the burial. It's all in front of you.
Workers began pulling sarcophagus fragments from the rubble. Once the pieces reached the lab, a skeptical Raquel Chachi grew increasingly convinced they had found Herod's tomb.
I kept on running from one room to the other every time. I'm sorry to interrupt you again with the work, but look at this, look at this.
This is where I lift my hands and say, wow, we have it.
But to convince the doubters, Netzer's team had to line up all the evidence. When they did, it looked irrefutable. First, the tomb and its 3 sarcophagi are royal in quality. 2 white coffins and 1 red were found. The most ornate is the red one, fit for a king. The 2 white ones likely entombed Herod's family members. Second, the complex in which the tomb was found is the only one in Judea named after Herod. And we know from the historian Josephus that Herod was buried here, somewhere. Third, the question of why the red sarcophagus was smashed was addressed after the team found new evidence from the mausoleum. The building stones revealed something unusual for an ancient structure, marks left by tools, indicating minimal exposure to the environment.
The tool marks are still visible. You see the hammers, the chisels, everything that was used. Normally when a building stands for a long time, these tool marks will become less and less visible. The fact that they are so visible gives the feeling that the building was not standing for hundreds of years. Maybe 50 years, maybe 60 years, but not more.
Looking at what happened about 60 years after Herod's death, the timing is almost perfect. Herodium was then occupied by Jewish rebels, trying to drive Rome from Judea. And no one detested Herod's memory more. The rebels had the motive to destroy Herod's tomb, and would likely have concentrated their anger on the sarcophagus they knew, or believed was his. The red, most royal one. Finally, Herod was the only known Judean worthy of such a lavish burial about 60 years before the demolition of the tomb. It all added up. It was time to announce their findings to the world.
An Israeli archaeologist says he has made a historic find.
Jerusalem, May 2007.
We found what we believe and have no doubt evidence and remains of Herod's tomb.
It was called the greatest archaeological discovery since the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Monuments in Judea.
And yet, the story didn't convince everyone. Without an inscription bearing Herod's name, the team's evidence was still circumstantial. Now, more than a decade after the discovery, some scholars are stepping forward, poking holes in the theory of Herod's tomb and sparking a new debate. Dr. Joseph Patrick, an archaeologist and former student of Ehud Netzer, believes Herod would never have built a tomb for himself like this one.
This is impossible. So the argument is the size. This is not a royal size. It is inconceivable. This could not be the resting place of Herod the Great.
The discovery of Herod's tomb at Herodium stands the test of time because it is true. This is the tomb.
If a tomb was found, it doesn't mean that this is Herod's. Herod's tomb may still be hidden. Or it might have disappeared.
After Ehud Netzer discovered what he believed was Herod's tomb, he continued to work at Herodium, searching for more artifacts. Even at age 76, he seemed unstoppable. Then, one day while on the site, a railing collapsed and he fell 18 feet down a steep hill and died from the injuries.
Ehud Netzer was my professor as an undergraduate, and his death in 2010 was as tragic as it was unexpected. The only positive thing I can say out of it is that somehow it seems right that he would have met his end here at Herodium, where he spent so many years exploring the site and bringing to light Herod's palaces.
Now, in his absence, his students and colleagues are defending or opposing the legitimacy of his discovery. Dr. Joseph Patrick wanted to prove to his former teacher that the tomb is yet to be found.
Unfortunately, I didn't have a time to talk with him about my doubt.
Patrick's doubts start with the coffin itself. He believes it should have been made from elaborately decorated marble, in keeping with the coffins of the Roman leaders Herod emulated.
Now, this reddish sarcophagus that was uncovered is impressive indeed, but it is not royal. And the tomb itself, the mausoleum here, is impressive, but this is not royal.
For Dr. Jody Magnus, this coffin is plenty royal. She firmly stands behind her late professor's discovery.
That red sarcophagus was the sarcophagus or the coffin of Herod himself because it is of exquisite workmanship. It's beautifully decorated and carved.
They're relatively simple. They're not from marble. But Herod, in his funeral, was brought to burial in a litter of gold with gems, decorated with expensive gems.
And in antiquity, the color red or purple was associated with royalty.
Even if red is royal, that doesn't explain the mystery of the central stairway. Joseph Patrick claims there was no royal way to see the royal tomb.
On the west, you see this triangular wall is the wall of the staircase, a very monumental staircase that leads where to? Not to the royal mausoleum. It leads up to the top of the mountain, skipping, bypassing the royal burial ground. How come? And then, where was the entrance to this place? Where? You cannot see it.
There had to be some sort of an access into it, right? So how do you gauge today, now, 2,000 years after Herod's time, who are we to say that the access that's there is appropriate versus not appropriate? How do we know what Herod thought was appropriate or not appropriate? That's not how we do scholarship.
If I think there is a serious mistake, I should point what is wrong with this identification. This is the idea.
It's not just the coffin and the staircase that seem odd to Patrick, but the size of the area surrounding them. It doesn't square with Josephus's account of the funeral.
The burial grounds, it is so small, it could accommodate maybe less than 100 people. In the funeral, the participants of the funeral was 18,500 people. Where could they stand? Where could they see the last phases of the procession? It is impossible here. And where they reach this place, it is impossible.
It's not small. The monument is not small because the whole mountain is the monument. So the mausoleum is part of a much larger complex.
The mausoleum and the mound are completely different entities. They should not be connected.
And this is one of the main points of contention. Did Herod see the whole mountain as his burial monument? Or is the burial tomb just one part of the whole? The scholars may never agree on the answer. But what they do agree on is that Herod's tomb is here, at Herodium. Patrick thinks the coffins that were uncovered were for Herod's relatives. The king's, he says, is yet to be found.
The big question is, where is the tomb?
He suspects the entrance is in Lower Herodium, near a large pool, where the crowds would have had enough room to gather for Herod's funeral.
The only possibility for such a multitude to assemble is here.
This was the same area Ehud Netzer once excavated in search of the tomb, to no avail. Patrick is determined to dig further until he finds it. But after all this time, new excavation, and doubts, Netzer's team remains confident the tomb found in 2007 is indeed Herod's.
When he built his tomb here, what Herod was saying is, this is how I want you to remember me forever.
Work goes on at the tomb that many scholars claim was once demolished to punish Herod for his brutal ways. So too, it seems, was Herod punished in life. He died at the age of 67, racked by a half-dozen excruciating ailments. Josephus suggests he had already been driven insane. In death, even as he was carried to his final resting place, Herod's legacy would begin to play out as stories of unbridled violence against a new king of the Jews, against his own family, and his own people. Yet it was Herod who left the most impressive architectural legacy in a land that had seen nothing as glorious as what he made. Masada, Caesarea, the Second Temple, and Herodium, where Ehud Netzer's legacy inspires searchers to continue solving the mystery of Herod's ultimate statement, his monument to himself.
The tomb of Christ. Millions of Christians revere this shrine as the final earthly resting place of Jesus.
This is sort of X marks the spot.
The epicenter of Christianity for almost 2,000 years.
You tread where Jesus trod. You see where Jesus died and was buried, and the tomb from which he rose. And the impression it makes upon one is unforgettable.
Ultimately, it is the place where Christianity starts.
But now this most sacred of sacred sites is in danger. The marble edifice over the tomb could collapse at any moment.
You could see that it had started to buckle.
There was a fear the pilgrims might have been endangered.
To save it, science and faith must work together. And for the first time in living history, open the tomb, revealing secrets hidden since the days of Jesus himself. Secrets now shared with the world by a team of National Geographic experts. What science uncovers could confirm the dearly held belief of Christians all over the world, or shatter those beliefs forever. Is this truly the tomb of Christ? In this holiest of cities, Jerusalem, in its holiest church, lies what many believe to be the tomb of Jesus Christ.
The claim of Christianity is that a historical drama transpired. It's about a man who was murdered, who rose from the dead, and that means that there's a place, okay? There's a time and place that we can pinpoint where that happened.
You tread where Jesus trod. You see where Jesus died and was buried, and the tomb from which he rose. And the impression it makes upon one is unforgettable.
For almost 2,000 years, pilgrims have flocked to Jerusalem's Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Millions of Christians drawn by faith to worship before this one stone slab. Underneath here is what is believed to be the holy bed, the limestone rock shelf in which the crucified body of Jesus lay until his resurrection from the dead. The holy bed is protected by a marble edifice built above it. It's known as the Edicule. This place is so sacred that 3 separate Christian groups control it between them. Each faction so passionate about their own beliefs that they rarely agree about anything. And minor disagreements can escalate into violence. This brawl between monks erupted when those from one denomination got in the way of another group's procession to the tomb. An ancient agreement known as the status quo tries to keep the peace. Under its terms, nothing can be done here unless every faction agrees. Outside the church, a builder's ladder stands against a window. It's been here since at least the year 1785. Over hundreds of years, the different Christian groups have never been able to agree to move it. It has become a symbol of how centuries of disagreement have meant centuries of neglect. And now, the tomb is at crisis point. The marble shelter over the tomb, the Edicule, is in danger of falling down. The very structure built to protect the holy tomb of Christ could now collapse and destroy it. It's not the first time that the Edicule has needed restoration. It's been destroyed and rebuilt many times.
The building was originally made of wood, which isn't really great if you've got hundreds and thousands of pilgrims with candles. It's burned down about 5 times.
The current Edicule is made of stronger stuff, solid marble. But it's 200 years old, and years of neglect have taken their toll. For decades, the structure has had to be held up by a disfiguring web of steel bars, built around it as a supporting cage.
When I first saw the Edicule, I thought, how can this be the most sacred site of Christianity? It looked like kind of an old train station with goop dripping down, and the building itself clad in marble. You could see that it had started to buckle. It upset me as someone who's looking at it and I'm saying, this isn't going to last.
Since the day it was built, the structure has been under assault from millions of pilgrim visitors and the smoke and heat from countless holy candles. Now it is critically weakened. If the edicule were to collapse, it could kill or injure anyone inside. Local police warned they might close the tomb. Time is fast running out for repairs to be made. The threat of imminent disaster makes it imperative to change the attitudes of ages. The patriarchs must come together as one to open up to science and to modern technology. That technology comes from Athens, from a team of scientists with a trusted reputation for restoring monuments, including the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul.
As you know, the cultural heritage of Greece is contributing to the world heritage. And we are proud of having developed the know-how and innovation to diagnose, to plan, and to protect cultural heritage.
On arrival in Jerusalem, Professor Moropoulou realizes she needs more than just technical skills. It will take limitless patience and diplomacy to make the various leaders agree on a plan. Her task is all the more challenging in a church that's been an unquestioning patriarchy for millennia.
There were a lot of very set minds at first, a lot of very somber faces of people who didn't want to budge, sort of like, that's not going to happen. It's not going to happen that way, or it's not going to happen that way. But I think the scientific intensity of Professor Antonio Moropoulou was like, okay, step by step, we'll do it.
Professor Moropoulou knows that only the fear of the edicule collapsing will make the patriarchs unanimously agree to the next step, giving the final go-ahead for her ambitious restoration plans. She rams home unpalatable facts over and over again.
So the columns were deviating from the vertical. This deviation was critical. There was a fear that the pilgrims might have been endangered during the pilgrimage.
Moropoulou needs details of the structural weaknesses within the shelter over the tomb. And for that, the team must look deep into its walls.
This is a ground-penetrating radar, and it's a system that actually can see through a structure, for example, through a wall. It's like when you go to the doctor and you see the baby inside the body, it's like an ultrasonic scan. In this case, we used it to see through the holy edicule, and we wanted to identify the structural layers from the exterior to the interior.
With 3D scanning, the team measure precise distances between the scanner and the object they're examining.
We used the handheld laser scanner to document all the stones that were removed from the holy edicule. We did 255 scans of the stones.
The minimum destructive has to be the way to approach a monument, and that's why we worked in a way that we were capable to have maximum informations with a minimum penetration.
But even modern non-destructive tests cannot reveal every hidden defect. In their Athens laboratories, others in the team analyze physical samples brought back from the Jerusalem church.
We're working on samples from the Holy Edicule. It's very interesting because through the mortars you can see one material embedded in the other. You can see almost how the edicule grew.
The Athens results reveal far more extensive damage than anyone had feared. Stonework weakened by water, cavities in the walls and foundations, mortar that is crumbling to dust. Faced with the sheer scale of the restoration that's needed, the church leaders finally agree. The work must start at once. But their agreement comes at a price. They impose an immovable deadline, dictated by the most important date in the church's calendar. Each Easter, priests enter the Holy Tomb and emerge with flaming torches. They claim that the flames spontaneously ignite from the holy bed of Christ. The miracle flames pass from person to person around the church. The patriarchs demand that nothing can interrupt this service. The restoration must be completed before the ceremony of the Holy Fire. And Easter is only 9 months away. With no time to waste, scientists start working where no scientists have worked before, inside the tomb itself. Their task is simply to repair a failing building, but doing that involves exploring its structure and the deep secrets of its past. It raises the possibility of finding evidence which could prove that this is the tomb of Christ, or that the beliefs of 2 billion Christians might be mistaken. The Edicule, the marble structure built to protect what many believe is the tomb of Christ, is being restored. The project requires scientists to study the tomb as it has never been studied before, which means that science might also answer the biggest question of all. Is this really the tomb of Christ? The claim that this is the tomb of Jesus stretches back almost 2,000 years into history. The Gospels describe Christ's crucifixion and death, but give few details about his final resting place. The Gospel of St. Matthew. So Joseph took down the body, wrapped it in linen, and placed it in a tomb hewn out of the rock. First-century tombs hewn out of the rock do still exist in Jerusalem.
This, in fact, is what the tomb of Jesus would have looked like. What I'm on right now is a bench, and people would have come through this door and gone through to the standing pit and dealt with the bones, the skeleton, the body would be left here on the bench. And there are little niches where people would put bones after the body had been completely decomposed.
Tombs like this show what Jesus' burial place would have looked like. What's less certain is where he was buried. The Bible tells us it was near the site of crucifixion, at a place called Golgotha, outside the walls of the city. Professor Taylor believes that was right here.
In first century Jerusalem, this was the street going to Jaffa, outside the city. And I would have just gone through a gate behind me called Ganath Gate. It would have led out, and this is where Jesus would have been led out to be crucified, in fact. On the right-hand side of me is the area of Golgotha. It was huge, a huge area of quarry. And right beside that, in between the quarry and the roadway, was where the Romans had their execution place. So the Romans liked to execute people in public, and this was a public thoroughfare.
The quarry by the side of that ancient thoroughfare changed a lot in the century following Christ's death. For many Christians, this was a time of intense persecution.
Romans thought of Christians as being magicians and cannibals and indulging in any kind of terrible thing you can think of, and yet Christians were attracting larger and larger numbers of people. In the middle of the 2nd century, the Emperor Hadrian, he had a chance to do something that would really deal a very, very heavy blow to Christians in completely obliterating the site that they claimed was where the resurrection took place. He leveled it all off. That area then became a temple of Venus.
Less than 200 years later, a historian claimed that Hadrian was trying to bury all traces of Jesus.
Eusebius in the 4th century, writing in Greek, says, "And they built a gloomy sanctuary to the impure demon of Venus to bury the Saviour's cave under such foul pollutions." So this is a tremendously important passage because it shows that the Romans wanted to deliberately bury the tomb of Christ and deal a terrible blow to Christianity.
The tomb was buried, but soon afterwards, just 300 years after the crucifixion, everything changed. The then Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity. With all the zeal of a convert, this first Christian emperor of Rome searched for the place where Jesus died and found it.
I used to be very skeptical. I just thought it was so very convenient for Constantine to create a new edifice just where the Temple of Venus was.
It could be that Constantine simply picked the temple site without really knowing if it was connected to Jesus. But Professor Taylor thinks that's unlikely. She believes that the shared cultural memory of the persecuted Christian community showed Constantine where he could find the buried tomb.
But the interesting thing is, as I've grown older, I'm more accepting of tradition being passed on by older people and memory continuing on.
Taylor thinks that Christian parents would have told their children and their children's children, ensuring that the whereabouts of Jesus' burial place would have cascaded down through the generations.
And I think that those Christians in Jerusalem would have seen the Temple of Venus being built, seen the tomb being buried, and thought, okay, it's still down there.
If Professor Taylor is right, it was those anecdotal stories from the local Christian population that inspired Constantine to demolish the Temple of Venus and dig underneath the ruins. Contemporary records say that he then excavated the entire hillside to leave the burial place exposed. Robin Griffiths-Jones, whose own church in London, England is based on the original Church of the Holy Sepulchre, explains.
He cuts away almost to the entire complex. The vestibule goes, the whole hillside goes, all the central chamber goes. So it is now almost unrecognizable. And anyone going there could well think, this doesn't look like a tomb as it would then have been. No, indeed it hasn't, because it has been so drastically cut away, cut down to the simple chamber.
This version of Constantine's excavation of the tomb has been accepted as historical fact for centuries. But now, scientists make an unexpected discovery. A discovery suggesting that the historians got it wrong. Just days into the restoration, the team strips marble wall panels from the edicule. Underneath, scientists expect to see masonry walls supporting the building. Instead, they find solid rock. It's a momentous discovery. What they found are the walls of the original burial cave. Constantine didn't completely destroy it. Some of the walls were simply covered up.
We never in our life imagined that would reveal the sides of the original cave that surrounded the tomb. History told us that that tomb had been flattened and opened up to the sky, but the sides of the cave were still there.
Ground-penetrating radar later maps the full extent of the hidden walls. They project upwards on each side of the burial bed. It's confirmation that the holy bed at the heart of the tomb was once inside a rock cave. And it means that for 1,700 years, pilgrims visiting the tomb have been standing inside that burial cave. They just never knew it at the time. Church authorities asked National Geographic to observe and record each stage of the restoration so it could be shared with the world. The National Geographic team, correspondent Tim Samuels and archaeologist Fred Hebert, are among the first to learn the secret of the walls.
That's the original rock.
That
is the side of the cave that was originally here.
And that shows that the burial cave is much more intact than we thought.
Yeah, it's more like lopping off the top of a soft-boiled egg. They lopped off the top, but at a much higher level than anyone had ever suspected. They cut a window here to actually show the side of the original cave. They're going to put a crystal plate there, but you're actually seeing it without any plate.
In nearly 2,000 years, no one had suspected that parts of the cave could be there. But as restoration work continues, scientists make a less welcome discovery. Deep in the structure of the Edicule, water has been seeping up from underground into the walls for years.
We discovered that the rainwater from the Christian street above, 10 meters above Jerusalem Street, were draining underneath the Holy Tomb, as well as the sewages of the whole complex were disposed underneath the Holy Tomb.
That rising water has eaten away at the Edicule's walls, destroying the mortar and disastrously weakening the structure. Looking to stem the rising tide, the team mapped the tiny watercourses and sewers that riddle the ground beneath the tomb. But this underworld also hides tunnels which aren't a part of the water systems. Tunnels which no one can explain. The restorers have discovered the original walls of the burial cave. Now, there's another revelation, which poses a worrying problem. Water is seeping upwards from underground and slowly destroying the structure. Archaeologist Frederick Hebert goes deep into the entrails of the Holy Sepulchre Church to investigate what lies beneath.
Wow. Look at this tunnel. I was not expecting a well-built ashlar masonry tunnel underneath the tomb of Christ with what looks like a hand-hewn doorway right here. This is completely unexpected. We had expected maybe some water cisterns or some water canalization, because that's typical of Jerusalem. But this is not that, it's dry in here. Then we thought maybe it's part of the old archaeological excavations. But this is no archaeological excavation. This is a well-built tunnel. It's stretching dozens of feet towards the center, towards the tomb of Christ. It's hewn straight out of the bedrock, the same rock that Jesus was placed on 2,000 years ago. We've gone almost 30 feet to get here underground, which means that we must be right underneath the most sacred site of Christianity. You know, a tunnel like this that stretches from an important religious monument, like the Tomb of Christ, it even has a shaft straight up to the floor, leading out. Appears to be some sort of escape tunnel or entry tunnel. This is something completely unknown. It's a magical moment.
Whatever purpose the tunnels once served remains a mystery and gives the restoration team no help in solving their toughest challenge. The Edicule's water-damaged and weakened old mortar must be replaced with strong, new cement.
If you can imagine architectural conservation is usually done by dismantling a building, repointing it, putting new mortar in, and then putting it back together. That wasn't possible.
Nothing can be done which might harm even the smallest stone from this most sacred site in Christendom. All the usual restoration methods are out of the question. It's a significant challenge, and time is running out as the immovable Easter deadline approaches. How can cavities within the walls be filled without taking it apart and rebuilding from scratch?
And we had a couple of moments that were really tense after figuring out where the structure needed to be repaired. Rather than taking it down, the Greek conservators figured out a way to keep the building standing but inject liquid mortar inside. Brilliant.
The team inserts tubes into every crack that they found in the walls. The plan is for liquid cement to be pumped under pressure down each tube. Running through the internal cracks and crevices, the cement should solidify and stabilize the structure. Everything is going well until they realize their brilliant plan has a glitch, a flaw endangering everything they want to achieve.
Some outside observer, maybe it was one of the masons there, said, we really need to open the tomb to put a moisture barrier in so that none of the liquid mortar goes in.
When the team calculate where the liquid mortar might run within the walls, they realize it could flow right down inside and onto the holy bed. It's a critical moment. The tomb has been sealed for hundreds of years, but now it has to be opened. Unless the restoration team gain access to build a dam against the encroaching cement, the holy bed will be damaged. Will the patriarchs from the different controlling groups ever agree to such a thing?
And I thought, well, this is going to be the end of the project, because the guys, the bigwigs, who don't agree on anything, they're going to have to agree on this. Something like, hey, let's open up the innermost shrines. Well, that's not going to happen. Christian pilgrims from all over the world have saved up their savings to go to the Edicule. And the patriarchs did not want to disappoint those pilgrims who are coming here on their once-of-a-lifetime visit to the epicenter of their faith. So that was a rule.
Professor Moropoulou needs unanimous agreement. She deploys all her persuasive skills. Just 5 months before Easter, the patriarchs finally bend their own rule. For 60 hours, and 60 hours only, they will open the tomb of Christ. Sunrise on the day the tomb of Christ is to open. For centuries, a marble slab has sealed the tomb. Today, it will be slid aside. A few witnesses will see the rock shelf, the holy bed, the final resting place of Jesus. Among them are National Geographic archaeologist Fred Hebert and correspondent Tim Samuels.
It's an incredible meeting of the top patriarchs of Christianity right here, and it's almost more important than the conservation work. The decision to open the tomb was absolutely, unequivocally a group decision of the patriarchs, who knew that we were all in checkmate if we couldn't inject the liquid mortars with 100% guarantee that the liquid mortar would not cover the holy rock.
For everyone at the Holy Sepulchre Church, this will be a day and a night to remember.
What do you hope you will see?
The rock, the natural rock.
How are you feeling?
We are emotion to see what we expected after so many years. Our emotion to see what is there.
The atmosphere was very hushed inside. They closed the doors of the church and locked us in. Some 50 of us, plus the monks.
Words come through that it's actually imminent. You know, potentially, this hasn't been touched since the 3rd century. Here we are in the 21st century, in the tomb of Jesus. It's about to be opened for the first time since then.
Δεν έχουμε τελειώσει ακόμα. Λοιπόν, να πάω λίγο εγώ. Ναι. Έλα. Ωραία. Έλα.
The National Geographic team is here to share the experience with a worldwide audience. But it's also an intense personal moment.
I mean, to the untrained eye, it's kind of, it's so hard to grab any meaning from this. And as a man of faith, how do you feel now?
My knees are shaking a little bit because I wasn't expecting this as much on behalf of being a scientist as being a human. So it's truly amazing.
With the top slit aside, witnesses expect to see a bare white rock on which Christ's body once lay. What they see is dust and debris.
What's happened is they've pulled the top of the marble slab back, and what we see underneath it is the debris. And to be honest, we don't know what's underneath the debris that you see there.
It was as if we had opened up what was underneath your bed that hadn't been cleaned in the last 2,000 years. It was the slow accumulation. It was the dust of ages. And it was fascinating.
It's essential the debris is cleared to reveal the holy bed below. But the Patriarch's ruling is clear. The tomb can stay open for just 60 hours, and the clock is officially ticking. By the next day, the dust of ages is gone, revealing new secrets of the tomb. Beneath the marble slab now slid aside, there's another, more ancient stone. It's cemented directly onto the holy bed below and engraved with a symbol that no one expected to find.
That was a surprise, you know. When we opened the tomb and we saw the engraved cross, we said this might be a cross of the era of the Crusaders.
Crusader armies controlled the Church of the Holy Sepulchre at various times in its war-torn history.
Jerusalem re-entered Christian hands in 1099, and at that very time a new devotion began to sweep through Europe, something much more emotional, much more affective, much more sense of the pathos of Christ's human life. And it's no coincidence that this matched the time of the Crusades and the resurgent pilgrimages to Christian Jerusalem.
The Crusaders brought with them a symbol adorning their battle tunics, the Crusaders' Cross, dating from around 1,000 years after Christ's death. But that date is much too late to match the legend of Constantine discovering the tomb just 300 years or so after Jesus was buried. The discovery of the Crusader Cross throws doubt on the whole story of Constantine and the tomb. But there is a plan that could verify the authenticity of this site. Professor Moropoulou's team is going to test the ancient cement that holds the engraved slab to the holy bed. If the cement proves to be from Constantine's era, this fits perfectly with the theory of his discovery. If it's later, then the real tomb of Christ could be elsewhere. This is not the first time that the authenticity of the Holy Sepulchre tomb has been questioned. In the 19th century, Protestant academics claimed that it could not be Christ's tomb because it was inside the city walls. Laws at the time of Christ's death forbade burials within the city. And then in 1867, another tomb was found, this one outside of the city walls.
When you enter into this tomb, you'll see that it's divided into two small chambers. The first chamber would have been primarily used as a preparation site where they would prepare the body for burial, and the inner chamber is the place where bodies were buried.
Known as the Garden Tomb, supporters claim that it matched gospel stories of the resurrection. John 19, verse 41. At the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb, in which no one had ever been laid. Near to the tomb itself, there are water channels and cisterns, which in the 19th century were seen as evidence that this could be a garden, as mentioned in the Bible. More importantly, those who promoted the garden tomb pointed to another Bible reading. Mark 15, verse 22. Then they brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of a skull. A hill in the shape of a skull can still be found next to the garden tomb. It's altered since this photograph was taken in around 1910, but the shape can faintly be seen.
It's not that picturesque image that people have in their minds when they imagine the crucifixion.
This now lies deep in the city, its neighbor a busy, noisy bus terminal. Perhaps a fitting reminder of where Jesus died.
We know that the crucifixion of Jesus was anything but picturesque. It wasn't this beautiful, reverent sight. Jesus was crucified on the roadside in a public place among the people.
The Garden Tomb is an amazing space. It's got such beauty, and you can really contemplate and think back on how things were in the first century. As a space for contemplation, it is fantastic.
Although she enjoys the peace of the Garden Tomb, Professor Taylor does not think it is a serious rival to the claims of the Holy Sepulchre Church. Archaeologists have dated the Garden Tomb to the Iron Age, around 800 years before Jesus was born.
What we know is that Jesus' tomb was newly cut. This is what the New Testament tells us, that it was a new tomb. So it's very unlikely it was a reused Iron Age tomb.
But what of the sunken eyes of Skull Hill, Golgotha, which first led pilgrims to this site?
This is just a kind of imaginative idea that the hill looks like a skull. If you think back 2,000 years, it would have been completely different at the time of Jesus.
Most academics now accept that the 19th century beliefs about the Garden Tomb were mistaken. And the discovery of the Crusader cross now raises similar questions of beliefs about the tomb inside the Holy Sepulchre Church. Despite those doubts, restoration remains the priority. With the tomb once again sealed, the rest of the work can move forward. The conservators' to-do list is endless. Repair and replace stonework. Remove the old steel support cage. Clean an irreplaceable gallery of murals and frescoes to reveal the original colors and restore their shining beauty. And with time running out, the team transform an ancient chapel of religion to serve the modern needs of science.
I didn't realize that 50 feet away there was a whole 21st century lab. Most of for archaeologists as well as conservators, most of our work is done in museums. And we're thinking, wow, they've taken the lab, the conservation lab, out of a museum and put it in the church. It showed actually the openness of the patriarchs. It's sort of like allowing a car mechanic to use your living room to fix your car.
Operating laboratories inside of the church is the only way the work can be completed in time. There is much to be done, and Easter is fast approaching. At the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, the restoration team has finished with just 3 weeks to spare before their Easter deadline. The tomb has been resealed without damage. Liquid cement has straightened the pillars. The ugly steel cage has been taken away, and the dirt of ages past has all been cleaned.
We delivered it intact and preserved, clean, colored, vivid, and a live monument, as it is the tomb of Christ. But the question is, how shall we preserve it with sustainability in the centuries to come?
Professor Moropoulou's caution is understandable. Because the Holy Sepulchre Church lies on an earthquake fault line, scientists use a seismic shaker table to establish the likely effect of future quakes. It proves the restored Edicule is stable for now.
We came up with the proper measures to be taken in order to strengthen it, so in the future it's not gonna be vulnerable to any earthquake.
21st century computer modeling techniques are also helping protect the tomb. Scientists will detect any future changes in the structure by comparing this cyberspace model created by National Geographic experts against the reality of the building over years to come.
We used a laser scanner and a technique called photogrammetry, which builds 3D maps from tens of thousands of photographs. If the Edicule were to start to settle into the ground or collapse or be destroyed again, the church has been destroyed many times over the history, naturally by fire and by religious extremists in the past. Were that ever to happen again, we at least have the best digital copy that technology can make right now.
National Geographic's work also means that anyone can now visit the Holy Sepulchre in the form of virtual reality.
You can see all the engraved texts on the side of the walls. You can see the entire conservation and restoration of the Edicule.
Following the success of restoration, such measures are helping future-proof the tomb. But a shadow still hangs over the entire project. The long-held belief has been that Constantine discovered the tomb 300 years after Christ's death. But the Crusader cross on the slab, cemented directly onto the holy bed, dates to around 1,000 years after Christ died. If the later date is accurate, the legend collapses, and with it, the authenticity of Christianity's most sacred site. In Athens, Professor Moropoulou's team spends months analyzing samples from Jerusalem. Their analysis reveals the most important secret of all from the tomb of Christ. The age of the cement securing the cross-engraved slab to the holy bed is confirmed. It dates to around 300 years after Christ's death. The story of Constantine appears to be true. The evidence supports the idea that this is the burial site of his legend. It's an amazing discovery, the crowning glory of this historic restoration. And unless the cross was carved into the stone centuries later, this could be one of the earliest Christian relics ever found.
It is a cross that represented the Christian faith, and the cross of Jerusalem was a symbol of recreating the Christian symbols and bringing them open to the public, to the pilgrims. That was a new era for Christianism, and it's not by chance that it happened in Jerusalem.
The incredible revelation dating the cement to around 300 years after Christ's crucifixion is the strongest evidence yet that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is the site discovered by Emperor Constantine. The sacred burial cave and holy bed where he believed Jesus was laid to rest and was resurrected from the dead. The tomb of Christ.
East Asia, 230 BC. After centuries of bloodshed, a warrior king rises to unite 7 warring kingdoms into one empire. The King of Qin forges a civilization that endures 2,000 years and bears his name, China. It takes 9 years of brutal combat for the warrior to achieve his goal and become China's first emperor. The first emperor's story has passed into legend, but the truth lies hidden inside the greatest tomb on Earth.
That is the first emperor's tomb. And it's at the center of what is thought to be the largest burial complex in the world.
Covering 22 square miles, this Chinese archaeological site is bigger than Egypt's Valley of the Kings and packed with treasures richer than Tutankhamun's tomb. My name's Albert Lin. I'm a National Geographic explorer, and I specialize in using technology to discover what lies below the Earth's surface.
The emperor's tomb is right beneath my feet.
My surveying drone can reveal this place as never seen before. Today, the tomb is surrounded by top-secret Chinese military bases, and the army is nervous about what the drone might pick up.
Nobody's ever been allowed to fly here. This is unprecedented access.
The first emperor is under this mound, but the entire site is the size of Manhattan. A mile east is a huge hangar protecting the world-famous Terracotta Army. It's just one of 600 pits at this extraordinary tomb site. Here, archaeologists are making explosive new discoveries. Military technology, a skull that might belong to an executed prince, and even mutilated concubines. Finds that could rewrite the history books.
That's how huge this site is. Can you imagine building this for yourself? For your afterlife?
I'm going to investigate every inch of this site and discover the truth about the man buried beneath it. I'm starting my investigation into China's founding father at the most famous part of his tomb site.
Wow. Wow. This is huge. It's so much bigger than I thought it would be. This is the Terracotta Army. 8,000 warriors buried over 2,000 years ago. One of the greatest wonders of the world.
This is the first emperor's army. He ordered his real army to be recreated in clay and buried with him, ready to fight his battles in the afterlife.
Each face is individual, unique. Look at the scale of this place. It tells you a lot about the guy. You know, his ego, his vision for his afterlife. What an experience.
These warriors are set for battle, exactly like the emperor's real army. Light infantry at the front, then heavy infantry, and even cavalry at the rear. 520 life-sized horses.
It's a really incredible feeling to be here. Standing in a place where nobody really gets access. I mean, we're at the center, at the heart of this unbelievable World Heritage Site, which is, in a lot of ways, the symbol of my own cultural heritage, my ancestry.
I've been fascinated by the first emperor ever since I was a child. And our knowledge mostly came from one place. For over 2,000 years, the Chinese have learned about their founding father from a book. The official history of his reign, called the Shiji, was written 100 years after his death.
This book tells of his epic battles, how he built an empire, how he created this place. But some of the achievements described here are so extraordinary
but they become hard to believe. The legend describes the future emperor as a peerless warrior with an unstoppable army. But is the legend really true? Right now, teams are unearthing new treasures across the tomb site that reveal more about the man and his army.
What a privilege. Very few people have been down here. All of this. It's stone armor, intricately woven together. Look at that. You've got all the little chains tied together, almost like chainmail. And nobody really knows what they're for, but they think that it's the armor that would have been worn by the soldiers that would follow him into the afterlife. It's really cool.
So far, they've discovered 87 suits of armor, painstakingly assembled from tiny pieces of stone.
If they find things like this here, 30 feet below the surface, you gotta wonder what else lies beyond.
Other storerooms on site hide further evidence of his high-tech army. Look at that. Because few realize that originally, the terracotta warriors carried lethal weapons. A select number of the soldiers would have swords, but they were real functioning weapons. Even though it was buried over 2,000 years ago, it is still razor sharp. You can almost shave with it. In the years that followed the burial of this terracotta army, the site was looted, and a lot of the weapons were taken. They were taken for actual use in battle. And that's why they only found about, so far, 20 or so of these swords. You know, the first emperor, he spent his whole life conquering these 6 warring states to create one single empire, using weapons just like this. And he built this army to take into his afterlife, and you realize that he was still at war. He was still preparing himself for battle. The technology buried here is so extensive, so state-of-the-art, clear physical evidence supporting the legend of a supreme warrior king who equipped and organized his army like no other. But the army is just the start. Because here, he also buried his entire world. On this side, you also dug? I'm working with the Chinese archaeologists. Combining my drone data and their site maps, we can reveal what lies within this mega tomb complex. At the center is the emperor. In front of him, the living quarters, next to which archaeologists are making truly gruesome discoveries. To the east, his army. Southeast is a pit containing a body that could be his son and heir. And further out, grisly evidence of mass graves. Now, the brutal evidence emerging from this tomb site will revolutionize what we know about the man who made China. China's first emperor. The legend tells us that his vision for the tomb grew to epic proportions.
朕要带领朕的天下，一切都是一模一样的。
The emperor was preparing for his afterlife in the same way he ruled his nation, with military precision. But there's a mystery. His vast workforce could create megastructures and build a huge mountain over his tomb. But no one in China had ever made life-sized statues before. So how did they suddenly create these 8,000 lifelike terracotta warriors? Most scholars believe that the Chinese developed them independently. But art historian Lucas Nickel has studied the terracotta army in great detail, and he has an astonishing new theory.
Yeah, thanks for meeting me here.
Well, we have a problem here. The terracotta warriors, they're totally exceptional and unique in Chinese history.
You're saying that there was nothing like this before? It just showed up right with this one particular moment in history here?
They have occasionally small figurines, but that's absolutely not comparable what we find in the first emperor's tomb. But these kind of really highly complex human figures, life-size, that's something we haven't seen before in China.
These 10-inch figurines were made in China hundreds of years earlier. But there's nothing like this from the time of the emperor. Then suddenly, the terracotta army mysteriously appears.
They just do it overnight. That is highly surprising.
Have you found an explanation?
Well, if we can't explain this as part of Chinese history, we have, of course, to look for a foreign source.
Right.
But we also have this. Have a look at that. These are sculptures.
Lucas believes that the source was the Greeks.
That is just on the rocks.
He has brought photographs of Greek statues that were found in Central Asia. Statues dated to the same era as the first emperor.
This is what the Greeks left in Central Asia. Yeah, that is just north of the Oxus River in southern Uzbekistan, yeah, just across the border from Afghanistan. Look at those features. It's the same idea. They try to make a totally believable human face.
I mean, when you look at the different features here, like the hair, you compare it to the hair up there, right? And the emphasis on facial realism.
Geographically, the Chinese and Greek cultures came very close to each other at this time. So communication was actually possible. They may have talked to each other.
We have to look towards our actual understanding of the timeline of East-West communication and rethink that.
Absolutely, that's right. These warriors force us to reconsider how East-West contact started.
The historical texts shed more light on this mystery. We're told, in 221 BC, 12 foreign statues appear at China's western border. A 100 years earlier, Alexander the Great had used statues to unify his newly conquered Greek Empire. The statues were a propaganda tool. And the suggestion is that the first emperor also recognizes their power. According to the legend, he orders 12 giant statues for his new capital city. But he also finds another use for them.
这应该被用于修建朕的皇陵，几千个一样的。朕要带领他们去统治另外一个世界。
遵命，陛下。需要多少？
朕要成千上万个。李斯，还有军队。
是的，陛下。
But who exactly was making these statues? In the 3rd century BC, the Greek and Chinese civilizations were much closer than you might think. So were Greek statue makers traveling to the new Chinese empire and working there? If Lucas is right, then the first direct contact between East and West would have happened up to 1,500 years earlier than we tend to believe. It's an explosive theory, and if correct, it'd be rewriting the history books. Forensic evidence is coming out of the site that I'm keen to investigate. Archaeologists have found a mysterious skull in one mass grave. It could be key to our investigation.
Now, to the untrained eye, it looks like any of the other skulls that we've seen here. But I've been told that this one is different. They're not typically Chinese features. Could this be a Westerner buried at the first emperor's tomb site?
I've sent detailed measurements of the skull to experts at Scotland's Dundee University. They're going to reconstruct the head and trace its origins. Experts at Dundee University have spent weeks analyzing it. I'm about to find out what they've discovered.
Hey, Chris.
How's it going?
Chris, you sent us a model of what you've made, and I haven't seen it yet. So let's take a look. It's a little creepy, you know? I mean, staring at this person who, it's so lifelike. So where would you place him in your expert analysis?
There's so many shape features of the skull that are East Asian, and then there's this sort of bridge to the nose and this brow ridge. It's not common in an East Asian population. This is actually a Chinese skull from a medical specimen. So you can see the difference between this nose and this.
Oh, yeah. So it is.
Yeah, we're talking this brow ridge and nose here.
So the analysis that you're describing is basically the facial features around the brow ridge and the nose are non-typical Asian features.
The skull overall is East Asian in appearance, but with a stronger than normal brow ridge and more projecting kind of nose than you'd normally expect.
This isn't conclusive proof, but it is plausible evidence that there may have been outsiders at the tomb site. And it supports the controversial theory that the first emperor imported foreigners and foreign ideas. In conservative China, that would have been shocking. This is the first time a Chinese ruler has created lifelike statues for his tomb.
Mm. 真是神奇的法术啊！怎么，害怕了？哈哈哈哈哈！
他眼睛看着我。 像是要活过来一样。
嗯，会的，他会的。
According to legend, the emperor grows increasingly paranoid. Fearing death, he orders his court to find the secret of immortality. And what they give him is mercury. His medics believe that it's the elixir of life.
可以使陛下长生不老。
In fact, mercury is a poison that will slowly destroy the very fabric of a person's brain and drive them insane. Sliding into madness, the emperor orders that no one is to know where he is, including his ministers. The first emperor's mental decline threatens the future of China. And the prime minister decides to act. He plots to put the emperor's youngest son, Hu Hai, in power.
他已经疯了，他会将我等所有人都处死的。不知父皇是否已经册立了太子？还未。我们得确保太子是殿下民意。
According to legend, what happens next will tear apart the emperor's family and plunge his empire into bloody warfare. I'm on the trail of a recent discovery that reveals how the reign of China's first emperor ended in bloodshed and brutality. I've heard about a set of 2,000-year-old scrolls that were found by chance on the Hong Kong black market. Written 100 years after the emperor's death, they describe his final moments. To ensure their survival, they have to be kept in water. Can I see it?
赵正书，赵正就是秦始皇。
Wow. Okay, so the fate of China came down to this one moment, the decision of who would take on the throne and follow in the first emperor's footsteps. And what these scrolls describe is that it was a coup. After 11 years on the throne, he is dying. The prime minister and the emperor's youngest son, Hu Hai, act fast.
父皇，您是知道的，儿臣一直是忠诚于您的儿子啊。 而李斯是忠诚于您的臣子，有什么事？父皇。
The successor is named just in time.
父皇，父皇，
知道该怎么办了吧？
我知道，但我需要时间。现在，不要跟任何人透露父皇的死讯。
In 210 BC, the emperor dies. But the story is far from over. The prime minister and Hu Hai keep the emperor's death a secret while they plot their next move. Fu Su, the emperor's eldest son and rightful heir to the throne, has been at the Great Wall defending the empire. He's the greatest threat to Hu Hai's bid for power.
再来吧。老板娘可以。报上名来，大胆！这是大秦的扶苏公子。坐下！你们什么人敢抓我？不要命了，敢抓我！大胆！
The legend tells us that Fu Su committed suicide. But the recently discovered ancient scrolls reveal a shocking twist.
秦王
Hu Hai
佛听
didn't listen,
遂行其意，
did as he wished,
杀其兄扶苏。
and killed his brother, Fu Su, the rightful heir to the throne. Incredible. This is amazing. And it's also just wild to think that this actual written word has been locked away in time for 2,000 years, and I'm holding it in my hand now. Incredible. The scrolls are a vital clue, but to prove exactly what happened, we need hard physical evidence. And now, the archaeologists at the tomb have revealed an extraordinary find.
清理，然后这是其中一个墓葬，墓主人的头骨。
We're looking at the skull of what could be the murdered heir to the throne of China. Oh, man. Look at that. I'm uncovering gruesome evidence of what might have happened to the eldest son of China's first emperor. This right here is the tip of an arrow. Looking at the trajectory of this arrowhead, which comes in at an angle like this, up to the jugular, it really indicates that this was a short-range kill. And what kind of weapon would do this?
弓弩.
Oh, really? A crossbow?
Yes.
So we're talking about a crossbow at short range, pulling in on this guy whose head is probably on the ground at this point, right through the jugular here. And it's incredibly deeply embedded within that bone. What we're talking about here is an execution-style kill. Seeing this arrowhead embedded in this skull just tells you something about how ruthless that moment was, a moment which defined the course of history. The scrolls say that Hu Hai's bid for power didn't end with killing his eldest brother. he murdered all of his siblings. Buried with this skull were the remains of 6 others. All were murdered and deposited to the east of the emperor's tomb. And according to legend, that was only the beginning of the bloodbath. The first emperor never married, but had many concubines.
姐姐真美。
你们都准备好了没？准备好了，赶快跟我走啊！
走。
So far, Hu Hai has eliminated any sibling who could challenge his rise to power. He now ensures that all remaining threats to his rule are neutralized, and that even includes concubines who might be carrying the first emperor's child.
你到底要带我们去哪儿啊？陛下为什么会在这种地方？
走。
Over 2,000 years later, possibly the most disturbing and horrifying discovery of all has been unearthed on the tomb site. The bones of young women. Their remains tell the story of the brutal end of females who may have been carrying the emperor's unborn heirs. I'm meeting with Huan Yang, one of the archaeologists working on this discovery, to find out what really happened.
Very far from it.
So tell me the story about the skull.
I believe they're concubines of the emperor.
What are the concubines?
Yeah. I know they're girls at a young age, and they have jewelries.
You found jewelry there.
Yeah. Do you want to see the jewelry?
Yeah.
Okay. Those is jewelry.
What is that? Is that pearls?
They're gold and pearls.
Wow, that's beautiful.
They're made very well. Even today, they're good quality pearls.
Yeah, they're still iridescent. They still radiate the light. Jewelry that would be of the level of a concubine of the first emperor, potentially.
Yeah, it belongs to some very high rank woman.
I mean, what happened to these women?
I feel a little bit angry about this. They're dying in a very brutal way. This 到底是什么地方？陛下现在在哪儿？
朕就是皇帝。 父皇他已经死了。他既然那么喜欢你，朕想，你可以陪他去了吧，把他们都杀了。
It's very weird. I found this pole, the leg bones just like this.
Yeah.
This one, and this side another one.
Near the skull.
Near the skull, it's just like a cross.
Must have been a horrible end.
It never happened before. At least we never found it.
These young women weren't just killed, they were mutilated.
Someone asked me, do you think they were broken after they die or before they die? I can't imagine that the human will cut those girls when they're alive.
This young woman is just the latest victim to be unearthed. Her only crime was being close to the dead emperor. The archaeologists have discovered 98 more tombs. So far, they've excavated 10, and each one contains the mutilated remains of a young woman. What we've discovered indicates that even some of the most extraordinary claims written in the historical record are true. What about the biggest legend of all? The one that describes the treasures buried within the first emperor's tomb. Could that be true too? The official history, the Shiji, describes it in great detail. It offers these tantalizing clues like mercury was used to fashion imitations of 100 rivers, constructed in such a way that they seem to flow. There's jewels embedded in the ceiling to make the constellations glitter at night. That there's crossbows rigged throughout the ceiling of the tomb itself to make sure that anybody trying to enter afterwards would be killed. But how much of that is true? To find out, I've come to speak to the tomb site's chief archaeologist, Professor Jiang. Over here. For the last 2 years, he and his team have been analyzing the tomb complex, using core sampling, ground-penetrating radar, and remote sensing technologies. You're trying to find more information with the probes, with the geophysics?
Yeah. 先弄清楚整个这个包括这个风头在内的整个大遗址的整个遗址的具体结构。
There's supposed to be a big cavity, a large void.
我们实际上就站在秦始皇陵这个封土的最中心的位置上面。
With the data that they have collected so far, the archaeologists believe that the tomb might still be intact. Using this data, we can now reveal what lies below. This pyramid-shaped mountain is entirely man-made. Each side is 1/4 mile long. Within it, a stone structure 410 feet wide, 476 feet long, with walls 45 feet tall. At the base is an inverted pyramid, descending further into the ground. The burial chamber lies at the very bottom. And there is one piece of evidence to suggest that the greatest legend about the tomb is true. This whole pyramid is riddled with high concentrations of mercury, consistent with there being rivers of liquid metal below. Within this tomb lies a man of vision and ruthless determination. A military leader who achieves the seemingly impossible, but also cruel, murderous, and eventually mad, unifying 7 warring states to form China. He has the vision for the Great Wall and builds this extraordinary tomb complex, the largest in the world. Above all, he laid the foundations of his nation.
He believed it would endure for 10,000 generations. And in a sense, he might be right. Even though his dynasty didn't last past the second emperor, his vision did. This nation his nation, China, lives on.
I start off by saying, hey, who wants to go scuba dive a pyramid in the Sahara and see what the reaction is? As an archaeologist, am I curious to open up a tomb and look and see what's inside? Absolutely I am. But no one's done anything quite like this. How do you excavate tombs in the desert underwater? Sudan has an incredible and long history. For hundreds of years, people have been focusing on the really big, well-preserved monuments of Egypt and overlooked what is today Sudan. You have pyramids, you have burial chambers that are probably unexcavated, you have dozens of kings, dozens and dozens of queens and princesses and princes. To have the opportunity to go in and excavate these things is really incredible.
Ah! Oh, look at that! Look at that! Look at that! That's gold!
Every time you go diving, you're putting yourself at risk. We're using surface-supplied air. It's one less thing to deal with having a big tank on your back in a confined environment where you're not entirely sure how sturdy the walls are. Just so we're all clear on the plan, go down to the chute, hold on to the chute, take a couple of deep breaths, and just hang out there. Good to go? Let's do it. And right as I hit the water, as the cold water starts to infiltrate into my wetsuit, I look up and start to have this thought about, okay, this is somebody's burial place. This is a place to be respected, a place to be learned from, a place to understand. And it just registers.
This watery grave is the 2,000-year-old burial place of a Nubian king named Nastasen.
Tombs give us time capsules, glimpses into the history of a people and place.
Archaeologist Pierce Paul Kreisman is hoping to learn more about who Nastasen was and the ancient world around him from the secrets his pyramid still holds. "30 feet above the dive, Site Inspector Fakhri Hassan and underwater archaeologist Kristen Romy are positioned to receive buckets of mud sent up from the tomb floor.
The goal of this season is to really begin to excavate the burial chamber of Nastasen. That requires moving a lot of material out of the burial chamber to be examined.
Each bucket holds a promise to reveal new clues about the king and how he was laid to rest.
So while we have divers down in the tomb and pulling up the buckets, the sieving needs to be done topside because we can't allow this material to dry out. Just in case there's something particularly fragile, because it could literally just turn to dust. Looking for gold and bones and anything that should not be in normal sediment. I
have water if you want.
Okay, I think this is good.
Enough?
But yep, I think this is enough. Ah, there you go. 5 minutes in, and we already hit gold. It's gold foil. So imagine like aluminum foil that's been crinkled over time. It's paper thin. It's almost like tissue paper. Tissue paper made of gold. This is good.
Good luck.
Yep, good luck. Thank you, Nastasin.
To the archaeologists, the early find of gold is a good sign they're on the right track. Even more exciting is what they discover next.
Oh! Hey, Fakri. Who is this?
A figurine called a Shabti is traditionally carved in the buried king's likeness.
This may be Nelly. Nastasia, because it's the same face, the same. But we will see. We will study and to make compare.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We will see.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
That's a good one.
A good one, yeah. This is new information. Just let us to understand our history more. This site is important because it's one of the royal cemeteries of Kush. This is one of the most ancient kingdom of the Sudan.
Beginning more than 4,000 years ago, the Kingdom of Kush ruled much of the Nubian desert, including what's now northern Sudan. From 650 to 300 BC, the Kushites buried their royalty near Napata, the heart of their dynasty at its most powerful point in history. Nuri is one of the most important burial grounds in this region, situated at the fourth cataract of the Nile.
There were more than 80 burials of kings, queens, princes, and princesses here at Nuri alone. There are only about 300 or 400 pyramids total in all of Egypt and Sudan. And for so many of them to be concentrated at this one place, that is incredible. This must have been the creme de la creme of the culture and society at the time.
Starting in 1913, American archaeologist George Reisner excavated many Kush burial sites, discovering the tombs of its most prominent kings.
Reisner was the first archaeologist to excavate at Nuri. He really put Nuri on a map.
He and his team moved from pyramid to pyramid, but they began to run into a problem. Water. When the men arrived at what's now known to be Nastasin's tomb, they found it partially flooded, and with one of the chambers collapsed.
Reisner, from what I understand, sent a very reluctant worker into this dark tomb. And from what it seems like, this worker kind of ran into the burial chamber, hastily dug a hole, pulled out a couple Shabtis to confirm it was indeed Nastasin, and then they got out of there.
They wanted to learn whose tomb it was. They ultimately got a couple Shabtis that had the king's name on it, Nastasin. But other than that, no one has been, as near as we can tell, no one's even been in this tomb since Nastasin was buried there.
In the centuries since Nastasin was laid to rest, the Nile River basin has risen at Nuri. Climate change, industrial agriculture, and construction of dams have changed the levels of the water, flooding many of the tombs. It's these waters that may have saved the rich burials from a common fate.
Of course, the problem with pyramids is that they're big targets. They say, hey, there's a big pile of loot buried underneath me, come get it. Even in ancient times, these tombs were being plundered left and right. However, at Nuri, it seems that these chambers were untouched because the water rose.
It becomes exceedingly more difficult to get to. Being underwater makes it off limits to most of humanity.
In 2018, Pierce Paul Kriesman launched his first expedition to open Nastasin's tomb. He invited underwater archaeologist Kristen Romey to join him.
I've done shipwrecks, I've been in caves, but I think there's nothing in the world that compares to diving in a tomb under a pyramid in a desert in Sudan. Nothing. For the first time going into a tomb and not knowing, I really could not have expected better conditions because the water level was not extremely high.
The water levels change from year to year, but it was immediately apparent why the pyramid had spooked Reisner's team. The groundwater from the Nile had risen into all three chambers of Nastasin's tomb. The smallest first chamber was completely submerged. The roof of the second chamber collapsed at some point in antiquity, creating an extra air pocket. The third and final chamber is where the king would have been buried, surrounded by treasures for the afterlife. But for Pierce Paul and Kristen, braving the flooded chambers paid off.
I think the big moment of realization of what we actually had in Nastasin's pyramid was when Pierce Paul led me to the third chamber in the back, and we were just waving our flashlights around, and he pointed to this little niche in the back wall, and the flashlight caught on the little bits of gold in the niche, left there for centuries and centuries and centuries. It was incredible. And when I realized that there was just like gold lying around, that this is an untouched burial.
If anybody had been in that tomb to rob it, it stands to reason they'd have taken the gold shiny stuff off of the shelf at eye level.
The untouched treasure is a hint that something else could be in the burial chamber. Something even rarer than gold.
In the middle of the third chamber, there is a large mound. It's got stones all around it. And it is very conveniently about the size of a person. It's about 6 feet long and about 3 feet wide, and then a pile around it.
This season, a year later, Pierce Paul is hoping to uncover the burial and learn whether Nastasin is still inside.
Pyramids in general don't often retain their intended occupants. It's actually exceedingly rare to find a pyramid with the person in it.
If you're looking at really kind of untouched royal burials in this part of the world, the last really big one was about a century ago. It was Tut. And he was really a relatively minor pharaoh in the bigger scheme of things. Tut's famous because he's got an untouched tomb. Nastasin, on the other hand, there's all sorts of major political upheaval in the ancient world that he's part of. Being able to excavate the untouched royal tomb of Nastasin, I think, is going to be an immense wealth of information.
Nuri is one of the most intensive concentrations of pyramids anywhere in the world across any culture and civilization. In Sudan, in fact, there are more pyramids than in Egypt. And this is a thing that people don't think of very often.
Kush and Egypt have a long, interwoven history, one that is just beginning to be more fully understood.
Most of what we know in the history books about the Kingdom of Kush comes from the perspective of the Egyptians, because the Egyptians had writing. And the Egyptians wrote everything down, everything.
They pushed a phenomenal amount of paper, we would say, in today's world. And we are fortunate to have a lot of those records. But those records frame everyone outside of Egypt as somehow not equal to, or lesser than.
History is written by the victors, the 1%, and archaeology tells the story of the underdogs, of the other 99%. The best way to really verify or disqualify a historical account is to look for the facts on the ground. Sometimes it jives with the history books, and sometimes it doesn't.
Archaeologist Jeff Emberling has excavated many important Kush monuments, uncovering its past, brick by brick.
We know that from the very first moment that Kush appears in history, around 2000 BC, it was powerful. It was so powerful that the Egyptians at that time built a series of fortresses along the Nile to protect themselves against the military power of Kush.
From its prime position on the Nile, the Kush Empire controlled trade routes from the south up to Egypt, transporting ivory, leopard skins, precious stones, and gold.
They had the connections with Inner Africa that could bring these exotic products all the way to Egypt and to the wider Mediterranean world.
They were the go-betweens, and they became very, very rich and powerful off being in that position.
Egypt relied on Kushite gold for their elaborate burials, and fierce Kushite warriors to supplement Egyptian armies. Eventually, the Kushites gained so much power, the Egyptians saw them as a threat and invaded their neighbors to the south. For the next 400 years, Kush was controlled by Egypt. In the beginning, the Egyptians imposed their gods and temples on Kush.
They were taking the elites of Kushite society and giving them Egyptian educations.
But the Kushites eventually became even more devout spiritual followers than their conquerors. Even as the Egyptian empire began to lose strength and withdraw in 1100 BC, the Kushites continued building their tombs in the shapes of pyramids. The jewelry found inside the burials makes clear their devotion to Egyptian gods.
We know that by at least, at the bare minimum, by the 8th century BC, Kush is on the rise. They have thrown off the shackles of their Egyptian colonizers, but they do retain some Egyptian elements.
For the center of their kingdom, the Kushites took over a place full of spiritual significance to the Egyptians. A stunning sandstone butte rising high above the desert landscape. Jebel Barkal, or Sacred Mountain. From here, the Kush kings were able to control an increasingly extensive territory.
Ultimately, that rise of power led to the Kushites being able to conquer all of Egypt. And that's historically just remarkable.
For nearly 100 years, a succession of 5 Kushite kings ruled all of Egypt. From Napata, their capital, they controlled more area than any other Egyptian pharaohs, stretching from modern-day Khartoum to the Mediterranean. One of these Kushite kings, a renowned warrior named Taharqa, established Nuri as a royal cemetery.
In many ways, Taharqa was the most notable 25th dynasty king. The cemetery that he established at Nuri became the royal burial ground for Kush for over 300 years. So he became the ancestor that the succeeding kings of Kush wanted to connect themselves to.
Kings like Nastasen, who Pierce Paul is hoping may still lie inside his tomb.
I would like to find evidence of Nastasen himself. I'm not saying I want to come up face to face with him in the middle of the third chamber in the dark, but it'd be an experience.
When Pierce Paul's team begins their second season of excavation, they find Nastasen's tomb in an unexpected and unnerving condition.
The morning of the first dive, I'll admit I was apprehensive. This was a completely different situation than it was last season.
We were all really surprised about how much water was in there. The water table was considerably lower last year. This year, we are now working with at least 15 feet more vertical of water.
Last season, the team attempted to pump the water out of the burial chambers, but the water pressure coming from the outside of the walls puts the tomb at great risk of collapsing.
When we tried to pump, it was just like a faucet running, and there's 100 different faucets coming through the walls. I don't think it's worth the risk. It's more like putting a paper bag in the ocean and then trying to take the water out of the paper bag. What do you think's gonna happen? The rest of the water's gonna rush in and try and it will crumple the bag. Regardless of whether or not we were able to safely and comfortably pump it dry and dig it, it's still a tomb. We don't want it to be a tomb for more than one person. Nastassin's plenty.
So you're coming in as well?
I'm coming in as well.
Okay. So today we're actually going to do excavation work. David's going to be on the outside, manning hoses, air, emergency, whatever. And I will go in first. If we touch hands, I might squeeze once. You squeeze once means okay. You do multiple squeezes, I'm going to pull you out through that chute.
Even though I kind of laid awake the night before, kind of running through my head, okay, you go down to this staircase, this is the way you enter the tomb, then you hit chamber 1, chamber 2, and I'm walking myself through it. I knew that regardless of how many times I was looping that through my head, it was not going to be what I was going to encounter.
Okay. So I bring in an empty bucket in, and I write down the number of
the empty bucket on the next line.
on the next line.
And then you figure out if it's A, B, C.
By carefully keeping track of where each of the buckets comes from, Pierce Paul will be able to match up any objects they find inside to specific areas of the tomb.
You're like, oh, my bucket came from, the northwest corner of that.
Piecing together the burial and laying clues to where Nastassin's remains might be.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Understood. Okay.
The biggest problem is going to be panic.
Of course.
Yeah. If something happens.
Claustrophobia and panic are
Yeah.
the biggest concern.
If you're inside and you are panicking, get to the air pocket. If you're by the front door, get out.
Yeah.
But get to the air pocket, sit and wait. Someone will come to you if you don't feel like you can get out on your own.
It's not easy. When you're topside, you're in this brilliant, Sudanese sun, and you've got the desert stretching as far as you could see, and you walk down this ceremonial staircase, and it gets progressively darker and colder and darker and colder. And once you're down in there, you're in another world, and it's a little bit scary, to be blunt.
Okay, Kristen, you're gonna be on this line.
Okay.
Paramount.
The minute that your head goes underwater and you start pulling yourself through that steel chute into the chamber, and you kind of realize the gravity of what's going on. And then you realize that the visibility shot. You have to kind of navigate your way through that first chamber to get into the air pocket in the second chamber. And it's just like every sense is 110%. You are just wired and just trying to figure out what's going to happen next.
So you're going in with 19 now? 19A. 19A, you got it. All right. See you in a minute. 1:30.
Kristen notes the time to track how long Pierce Paul is working in the third chamber. If he's gone more than a few minutes, she'll have to go in and try to find him.
We know that the second chamber of the burial suite beneath the pyramid has already collapsed at some point in history. And so there's no reason why other parts of that tomb can't collapse.
When we first got back here from last year, the water was crystal clear. We came into the tomb, and came up. We thought there was an air pocket. The water was so clear that we just hit our heads and looked up and saw our bubbles going against the roof. What's going on here? It was phenomenal.
At first, Pierce Paul could clearly make out familiar landmarks. The niche that had housed flakes of gold. Decorative blocks cut from stone. And the burial itself, a mound of rocks that may still hold Nastasen's remains. But now, the visibility is next to nothing.
Because of the rock falls, because of the collapses, because of the sands that have blown into it, as soon as you start getting in there, you start stirring it up, and very quickly, once we start working, it's zero visibility. It's as if you're doing it blindfolded, sometimes upside down, and you're just trying to do the best you can to understand the situation and make this mental map.
You are trying to find important things solely by touch. You cannot use your eyes, you cannot use any other sense but your touch and your mental memory.
This is a Shabti. It's buried with the king, and it's a person to help him in the afterlife, so he doesn't have to deal with the drudgery of day-to-day work. Oh, it's a data. Yeah, it's great. Incredible condition. The season so far, I'm most proud of that we get out of the tomb every day safely. That is number one. Number two, I really do think we're making progress. I think we're learning more every day. We're getting information that makes this worth it. So there's a major gap in our understanding in the transition of this one kingdom, the people of Napata. After hundreds of years of burying their kings here, they just stop. Nastasen falls at a really important time for us. He is the last king buried at Nuri. Why do they stop? Why do they then move from one place or another to another? Who makes those decisions? Because you don't bury yourself.
The 4th century BC in Kush was a little bit of a turbulent time, and we see this in a number of different ways, including the locations of royal burials. A king's decision about where to build his pyramid probably had a lot of different motivations behind it.
To investigate these motivations and what could have caused this tumultuous time, archaeologists Jeff Emberling and Sami El Amin are turning their attention from the elite to the ordinary. Nearby the royal temple that hosted coronations for a long line of kings and pharaohs, Jeff and his colleagues are unearthing a town that hasn't seen daylight in thousands of years.
I've always loved digging settlements. I'm always just interested in how everybody lived and not just how the kings lived. I don't know, I kind of don't trust those people, those kings. And I would rather be able to tell history in a way that included all of us and all of them.
Jeff has been excavating royal temples and burials around Jebel Barkal for 14 years. But he'd always wondered where the people who built the structures and supported the elite lived. He knew there must have been a town nearby, long ago buried under the sand.
Those are the kinds of questions that keep me going as an archaeologist. What is it that we don't know that's under our feet?
As building walls, streets, and alleys emerge from the sand, Jeff and his team can begin to piece together what this ancient city would have looked like.
Yeah.
In the shadow of Jebel Barkal, at least 10 large buildings would have been anchors to different neighborhoods, dividing the city into districts. Homes are organized into city blocks, an early indication of urban planning. What happened inside the homes may give a glimpse into how prosperous the people of Napata actually were. The section of the city Jeff is excavating seems to have been organized around a big building, with smaller structures around it.
We're looking at the outer wall of this building. It goes down, it turns a corner, and so the building is extending off in this direction. We're hoping to find whatever it is that they were doing and making in this building, and you can't predict what that's going to be. But we expect that underneath our feet goes down centuries, if not 1,000 years. There's a series of rooms in between these walls, and then that's the outside of the building where the pile of sand is, and that's where we start to find objects that were related to the use of the building. That's where frankly, the garbage was. That's what tells us what people were doing here.
One of the town garbage pits indicates an ancient storeroom, which would have kept food, oils, and other essentials. Centuries later, the tossed away lids and labels that sealed the jars reveal more than meets the eye.
They literally found thousands of sealings in the pit here over here, which is very interesting. And I will pull one out here, which was excavated this season here. It's made of clay, and it's a jar stopper. That's at the top of the jar. You have cloth beneath, and you have this lump of clay above in order to close the jar. And when you're done that, you will take your golden ring, like this one here, and you will stamp this jar stopper with your ring in order to preserve this sealing here. So if you look closely through the magnifier, you will be able to see the sealing present once in a while.
Each town official had his own ring with its own unique image, a personalized seal to verify oversight and responsibility for the contents inside.
But we have a nice example, one of the other sealings here. But if you look closely here, you can see you have this elongated figure here, and we think actually it's a lion head over here, and you can see the half ring over here as well. That's another sealing as well. So that would be the head of the crocodile, we think.
For Jeff, the seal impressions are evidence of a complex economic system that may help reconstruct the royal power structure at Jebel Barkal. As the team digs deeper, they'll reach older layers of the town and even more ancient clues as to how society operated.
This season, we've got down to probably the 3rd century BC. So probably the next level down is going to be the time of Nastasian. And it's very possible that we might find seal impressions with names of kings, maybe even names of kings we don't know about. So there are possible ways that we could fill in that history. Of course, we can't guarantee that we'll find those, but they're here somewhere.
Soon after Nastasian's reign, around 315 BC, the Kushites moved their center of political power away from Napata. The forces behind this shift remain a mystery, but the archaeologists are beginning to rule out one major possibility.
You can get indications of how prosperous a time and place was based on the burials of people, right? Especially the burials of your kings. If the most powerful and important person in your society is buried in a very modest way, it would suggest that either there is a cultural shift of some kind toward this sort of modesty, or that the resources weren't available. Nastasian's tomb isn't that. There are pretty good indications that he had all of the needs and equipment and resources that a king would have, and that he was well equipped for the afterlife.
Morning, how are you?
Good, how you doing?
Good.
You had a pretty good day yesterday.
Yeah? How good of a day?
Pretty good. You want to come sing?
Yeah, I do.
we got some interesting things out.
Wow.
Yeah. So I
still
think
got some gold on it.
So it would have been gold leaf.
Yep.
It's got some more here, and once we have it cleaned, more will come off underneath.
That's gorgeous.
If this is what we think it is, I'm only aware of one other really prominent example of this, so it makes it an essential discovery. Have you seen the Hemen and Taharqa statuette in the Louvre?
Yes.
It's got Taharqa sitting making offerings to the bird god. I think that's what this is. So there should be a little statue of Nistasin making offerings. So we need to go find the pair of Nistasin.
Okay. That's a mission.
Yep.
Mission taken on here.
Over the next few days, the team pulls an increasing amount of evidence from the tomb, pointing to a burial of a king who wanted to be revered and remembered.
All right, we've got another box.
Okay.
For 8.
Bucket in. Okay.
Shopty, all right.
And charcoal.
Charcoal.
Yep.
Okay.
Bits of charcoal could be evidence of a burnt offering made at the time of the burial.
I've got more charcoal here. I've got a good amount of charcoal.
Charcoal. Oh.
Oh!
Yeah.
That's the biggest piece of gold I've seen.
Yeah. Okay, and I'm...
Gold foil that would have covered objects like the statue of the falcon god.
Beautiful.
I win.
I know you win. You win. You win.
Gold, okay. Yep, these are gold.
Oh, get more gold.
Here, I'm leaving you a gift. It's the bag. Day of gold.
Day of gold. Ah,
Yeah.
there's some more right there.
Yeah. Day of Sunny.
Okay.
Oh, hey, it's the biggest bone I've found yet.
Oh, yeah.
As we get closer to the central parts of the tomb, we started to find pieces of bone that are darkened. And yes, this could be from having been burned or charred, but this can be what happens to bones underwater.
See that? What is that leather maybe, or
Here?
it's in the mud? Here.
Yeah.
Oh, whoa, more leather. Yeah, that's leather.
Okay, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
We got out what we think are some pieces of leather, and if these are pieces of leather, that would be consistent with the types of burials from this time and place in which they might have been put on or wrapped in a hide mat.
Yep.
If that's what this is, then it's another good indication that, yeah, the king was or is here.
With each day of discovery at Nuri, Pierce Paul is getting closer to honing in on what might be the burial and body of King Nistasin.
As of today, the tomb looks something like this. We got the niche up here, the entry. So this is the third chamber. We have a very large slab. I think this is a fall from the roof. Now yesterday, because we moved a lot of the blocks from inside the burial chamber, things got a lot clearer. What we have is a basically flat tabletop. It feels like it's so shockingly flat. It feels intentional. But this piece is big enough so that when I'm laying on top of it, with my arms and legs spread out, I can barely touch the corners of all four at the same time. So it's massive.
Through his finds and careful mapping of their locations, Pierce Paul is able to reconstruct what he'd be seeing in the tomb if the water were clear, centered around the area where Nistasin may lie.
So we have a big slab in the middle of the room. There's one rock left here, one piece standing up against the wall. This fell after the burial because there is a shabti stuck under the corner of it. So the Shabtis are actually lined up along 2 walls. We found a bunch of them in place here, and then they've been along the wall like this, every couple of inches, all the way down. The falcon deity was over here, and it wasn't directly on the floor. And out of here, we got bone fragments, and we got what looks to be big patches of leather. If the king is in there, it makes sense for him to be in the middle of the room, and so he should be underneath this slab. Progress has been great. The goal had been to complete the excavation this season. I don't think we'll make it, in part because we're finding too much, which is a terrible and wonderful problem to have.
If you think of it in some ways, archaeology is kind of like trying to figure out an ancient crime scene, right? Everybody's dead. Nobody can speak for themselves, and all you have is the physical evidence around it. But instead of, spent shotgun shells, you've got pottery and inscriptions and all these wonderful pieces of puzzle that you really have to patiently put together.
Gosh, look at the visibility. I can even see bubbles in there on occasion.
So,
Pierce Paul and Kristen review some of the footage of Nastasin's tomb to assess whether there's a possibility he's still inside.
Had been gilded, that then got squished.
The rock falls in the tomb block them from getting a clear picture, but it could also be a stroke of luck.
How many falls do you think you got there?
At least 2. What I'm hoping is that the things coming down from the ceiling, yes, they crush some stuff, but they also push it out.
Yeah.
We found some shattered parts of bone, probably human. We found gold leaf. We found leather. We found the little statuette of a deity.
So essentially, you're dealing with a tomb tsunami in some sense,
yes,
right?
It's great because I think the likelihood is high that there's more there because it's protected, smushed, but protected. I can imagine that this gigantic slab has prevented anybody else since that event occurred from doing anything to get to whatever is underneath it, which is in the center of the room, which is where all these burials are.
Yes, which is where Nastassin should be if he's in there.
Yeah.
Now we just have to figure out
what's the technical way to do it, if at all, which is also one of the questions. Is this a thing that we can do today, or is it a thing that we leave to someone else in the future?
For immediate gratification, that's disappointing because you've got a big rock in the way. But for long-term prospects, it's really intriguing. We may have Nastassin still inside that tomb.
After Nastassin's reign and the mysterious move from Napata, the Kushites began a new era. While still prosperous for centuries, the kingdom's power would never again extend as far as it had when it ruled Egypt.
It is a really engaging time in human history, and it's these foundations, these things that we look back in our own history books and say, gosh, these are important events in our world too.
For nearly 2,000 years, temples were built and rebuilt at the foot of Jebel Barkal. While the mountain center of power didn't last forever, its spirit endures today.
These places and these kings of Kush are still really significant in modern Sudan. But it's beyond just history. It's a very rich connection that Sudanese have to these places. They all know about their historical importance, but they're also a part of their daily lives.
The people are very connected to the mountain itself initially. But in the recent years, with the rate of the archaeological discoveries, the people become more interested in the history and in the antiquities, and they now ask a lot of questions about the antiquities and the history and the civilization as well.
One thing that archaeology teaches us as we look over the centuries is that things really do go wrong. Cultures do collapse. Civilizations disappear. One of the things I take from studying archaeology and history is that the decisions that we make really matter.